In this lesson, we're going to cover ngForm and ngModel. So if you open up your passenger form component, which we have rendered out our details object, what we're going to do is essentially set up something called a template ref, which we've already looked at. So what we'll do here is form and then equals ngForm. So what this essentially does is export the ngForm, which is an Angular directive which works under the hood to essentially keep track of all of the state changes and all the validation of our inputs inside our form. There's also one more thing that we need to add, which is something called noValidate. So we can tell the form to not validate it because we want to use Angular's built-in validation. So what we're going to do is move this up here and we'll remove the words form. Now we'll build out our first input. So inside of here, we're just going to start with the passenger name just to keep things simple. So we can do input and we'll give it a type of text. Now, because this is a template driven form, each input needs to have a name, and the name that you create will actually create a property on the form for you as an object. So in this case, our detail, we actually had a property called detail.fullName. So we actually want to map that across and use it here as well. And then we'll just close this one off here. What we can do to actually see that this form is changing is because we're using a template ref, which is the hash form, we could do form and then .value. And again, we'll create the JSON pipe. So let's go ahead and check this out in the browser. So you can see that we have passenger name, we have our input, we have our data that's being passed in via an input binding, and we have this empty object. So currently nothing has been registered with our ngForm. And this is where something called ngModel comes in. So let's go back. So what we can do is simply add the word ngModel. So we can actually use ngModel as a standalone attribute, which is a directive itself from Angular. So now let's go back to the browser and see a different response. So you can see now that we have a property by default called fullName. So this is our input data and this is our form value. Now once I start typing, you can see that this property is being updated via Angular. So ngModel is synchronizing the form values for you. Now at this point, you might be thinking that you need to go back and update this data. However, because we're using template-driven forms, the template is the source of truth. So ideally, all of the properties that we want to create need to be bound to some form of input and registered inside the form to be picked up via Angular. And you can see that we can still update these models and they work as intended. Now, obviously, we have this full name of Steve, which was our registered person. He has an ID of 1. So what happens when we need to set an initial value? Let's go back and take a look. So because we have this detail and we have an ngModel, how do we communicate between the two? Because we can bind to an ngModel using a property binding, we can just simply pass detail and then .fullName. So what this essentially does is take the detail object and creates a one-way binding from the ngModel. So at runtime, we can use our ngModel. However, we're using detail.fullName to essentially populate it with an initial value. Now, because this is an asynchronous call, detail.fullName may not be available. As you can see inside the dashboard viewer, the passenger object is being passed back through a service call. So this .passenger isn't actually available at this point in time. So there are two options here. We can create an object inside of here and we can say full name and then null, which will essentially allow us to create these initial values. However, this isn't really the best way to do things because we're initializing new objects inside. So earlier in the course, we learned about the safe navigation operator, which is this question mark here. So when the value becomes available, it's essentially going to one-way bind to the ngModel. So let's go and check this out. So you can see here that this is the original data model. At runtime, the value has been found. The passenger name of Steve has then been bound to the input. Now, the interesting thing is if I change this to Todd, you can see that our form value is changing. However, our initial value is not changing because this is just a reference model that's been passed down. So the most important thing to remember is that the template is the source of truth, which is the form.value, which we're logging out here. The next thing that we can do is create the passenger ID. So what we'll do is simply copy this, and what we'll do is add it underneath. Now this is going to be of type number, and instead of using the name of full name, what we'll do is change this to an ID, and the passenger also has an ID, and we'll change passenger name to ID. We'll save this out and go back to the browser. So you can see our initial data has an ID of 1, full name is then Steve, Steve is populated, passenger ID is then populated. We can actually use the numbers to increment this, and you can see that this value is changing. Now it won't let me type any letters, however I can type some numbers if I wanted to. So if I wanted to change the passenger ID, I could then submit the event, which we'll come on to later in this chapter. So again, we are populating our data model from the ngForm, which we're exporting as a template reference variable, so we can actually see things for debugging purposes. Our initial data set, we're populating and binding to ngModels. We can change the ngModels. We can set them via one-way bindings. So that's essentially how to create a form using ngModel and inputs.